Those who served in the German forces and gave themselves up in places like North Africa, France, or Italy braced themselves for a bleak destiny the moment they were taken. Over the preceding years, the relentless messaging from Nazi sources had filled their minds with horrifying accounts of the torments facing anyone unfortunate enough to be seized by foes. Grueling work deep underground in mines, brutal assaults by overseers, meager scraps of food that left them wasting away, and constant degradation. A great number of these troops had absorbed such tales from childhood onward, so as they stood in formation, stripped of their weapons, and were herded toward imprisonment, their thoughts conjured vivid scenes of impending horror. Gazing at the U.S. vehicles and sentries around them, they took in the evident orderliness, while also registering the relaxed demeanor the captors displayed toward those in their charge. Rather than barking threats or striking out, these Americans extended packs of smokes, canteens of drink, and occasionally a light-hearted remark. Even so, the detainees held on to their wariness. It must have been a deception of some kind. The prisoners figured that the real brutality would emerge only after their arduous voyage to America concluded. The means of transport turned out to be yet another unexpected development. Rather than being packed into squalid livestock wagons devoid of fresh air, numerous individuals ended up on legitimate vessels or rail cars, under watch yet spared from mistreatment. Provisions were handed out, white bread, meat, coffee, and opportunities for repose were granted. To soldiers accustomed to the deprivations of war, such provision seemed utterly perplexing. In hushed tones, they murmured to one another, "Why squander rations on foes? Why extend mercy to those who had sought their lives?" Explanations escaped them, and doubt persisted. Maybe the U.S. forces aimed to preserve their vitality for grueling toil. Maybe this leniency served as a prelude to more severe retribution. A few went so far as to suspect they were being plumped up for sinister medical trials, so profoundly etched were the tales of terror from their homeland. While traversing the Atlantic, gazing upon the immense sea that divided them from their native lands, an oppressive quietude frequently settled over the ship's platforms. These soldiers had prepared rigorously to dominate Europe, adhering to Hitler's directives and viewing themselves as elite fighters in a Reich destined to endure for a millennium. In an abrupt reversal, they found themselves confined as captives, stripped of authority, and left wondering about the destiny that lay ahead. The United States was hardly the destination they had ever envisioned reaching in this manner. For most, it represented merely a remote hub of manufacturing prowess, filled with towering buildings, lively jazz rhythms, and cinematic productions from Hollywood. Nevertheless, they now stood upon its soil, not in the roles of sightseers or victors, but as those taken prisoner. Initial views of the U.S. shoreline evoked a blend of apprehension and intrigue. Impressive ports, expansive urban centers, and unbroken lines of manufacturing plants validated the tales of America's formidable production capacity. The detainees marveled at the immense scale of it all, from the massive lifting devices and vessels to the broad thoroughfares. Long before they reached the facilities assigned to them, an awareness dawned of the country's enormous expanse and the abundance of assets it commanded. For troops from Germany who had battled fiercely amid ever scarcer provisions, this disparity proved deeply unsettling. As soon as they were herded onto buses and trucks, the trip toward the interior got underway. Peering out the windows, the captives took in vistas entirely foreign to their European experiences. Vast expanses of open prairie that extended beyond the horizon, interminable highways, and modest villages dotted with glowing neon lights and fuel depots. Youngsters along the route often waved at the moving columns, while residents occasionally assembled to catch a look at the captured foes. For their part, the prisoners gazed in awe at the plentiful supplies and everyday luxuries evident in typical U.S. existence. If such a place belonged to those who had defeated them, what implications did that hold for the conflict they had waged? These ponderings echoed more insistently within them. Reaching the enclosures brought yet another eye-opening discovery. Neat lines of dormitories, dining areas, health clinics, and leisure spaces awaited their arrival. Barbed wire fencing was there as anticipated, yet it enclosed structured setups instead of filthy dungeons. Rather than facing beatings or deprivation, they underwent swift administrative handling, received bedding assignments, and were issued clothing. A few remained wary of malice concealed within the apparent discipline. In contrast, some started to contemplate whether the United States' power stemmed not just from its armaments, but also from an unusual form of decency extended to adversaries. But this marked merely the start. Over the ensuing months, the German captives would encounter further jolts, deeper inconsistencies, and additional instances that upended their entire understanding of those holding them. Still, right there on that initial evening, as they settled into their beds with satisfied bellies and weariness drawing them toward slumber, murmurs spread across the sleeping quarters. In a place like this supposed detention facility, what lay in store? Not one among them could have anticipated that the following astonishment would emerge from the shimmering light of a cinema projection. Those opening days within the U.S. enclosures offered a vivid lesson in opposites. The Germans had steeled themselves against bellowing overseers, humiliating penalties, and perpetual starvation. What met them, however, was structure and regularity. Discipline during roll calls remained rigid, though free of any physical punishment. Sentries bore firearms, yet they frequently relaxed in posture, engaging in casual conversations instead of issuing sharp commands. Perimeter barriers rose high with coils of razor-sharp wire overhead, but the atmosphere carried the inviting aroma of prepared dishes wafting from the communal eating area. Within the sleeping quarters, rows of bunks stood in orderly fashion, topped with padding filled with genuine linens and supplemented by heaters to fend off the chill during winter months. Conditions fell short of opulence, to be sure, but they diverged sharply from the horrors that had filled the captives' minds. The provisions at mealtime proved the greatest revelation of all. Detainees had braced for meager gruel or hardened loaves, similar to the sparse allotments that plagued ordinary citizens in Germany amid the conflict. Instead, servers brought forth platters brimming with substantial servings, slices of meatloaf alongside spuds, legumes, hot beverages, dairy, and sometimes fresh produce. Such plenty bordered on the unbelievable. Soldiers who had endured campaigns in icy terrains, subsisting on dark loaves and diluted stews, now found themselves before dishes reminiscent of family suppers back home. A few held back at first, wary that the offerings might harbor poisons or toxins, yet appetite eventually triumphed over doubt, transforming incredulity into subdued appreciation. Whispers circulated among them. Our hosts nourish us more generously than our military ever managed. In addition to sustenance, the enclosures offered surprising elements of everyday routine. Shipments from the Red Cross arrived bearing essentials like cleansing bars, dental paste, and supplies for correspondence. Medical facilities in the camps provided care for injuries and sicknesses. From time to time, the guards distributed cigarettes, while certain facilities even included modest collections of reading materials like books and periodicals. The inmates were astonished to learn that they could send correspondence to their loved ones, albeit under strict review. Simply composing those messages and receiving replies from relatives seemed nothing short of wondrous, rekindling a connection to the life they had assumed was severed forever. Naturally, rules were in place to govern behavior. Efforts to flee met with penalties, and evening lockdowns were strictly upheld. However, repercussions typically involved isolation rather than savage beatings. The U.S. authorities appeared far more focused on upholding structure than on delivering torment. This approach left the captives deeply disoriented. Propaganda had portrayed the Americans as savage, morally corrupt savages, devoid of self-control or equity. In reality, they encountered a regime that, though firm, possessed an unexpected aura of impartiality. The enclosures were built to hold individuals secure, not to shatter their spirits. The landscape itself added to their confusion. Numerous sites lay in countryside regions across the southern, central, and western parts of the United States. Beyond the barriers, the men gazed upon vast stretches of cultivated land, wooded expanses, and quaint villages. Local growers tilled adjacent plots, and occasionally detainees were escorted to assist in farm tasks. They were taken aback by how everyday Americans regarded them without animosity, but with a detached curiosity, treating them like any transient band of laborers. Youngsters would occasionally greet them with waves. In some instances, local women shared baked goods or loaves with the sentries, and witnessing this everyday routine disturbed soldiers who had envisioned the country solely as a realm of bitter adversaries. As darkness fell, and the sleeping quarters fell silent, numerous detainees murmured in hushed tones about the peculiar circumstances. Could this truly be imprisonment? In hushed exchanges among the captives, one might pose the question. A companion could counter, "Perhaps this is just a prelude to harsher treatment ahead." Gradually, some voices ventured into riskier territory. What if the stories we'd heard about America turned out to be false? From these subdued dialogues, the first hints of uncertainty took root. Among soldiers conditioned to view existence in stark black-and-white terms, where the Reich stood as humanity's highest achievement and the enemy powers as savages, the simple acts of decency and ease in daily captivity began to chip away at convictions that had felt utterly unassailable. Nevertheless, nobody anticipated the developments that followed. Apparently, the U.S. captors weren't satisfied merely with offering sustenance, lodging, and security. They planned something additional, an innovation so startling and peculiar that numerous POWs dismissed it as a mere figment of fancy. Before long, the men assembled in spacious auditoriums or improvised venues, and for the initial occasion since departing their homeland, they ventured well past the enclosure's barriers. This journey came not through flight, but through the luminous scenes cast upon a cinema display. Gradually, the pattern of existence in the enclosure evolved into habits that offered solace, even as they bred bewilderment for the German detainees. Mornings commenced with head counts, succeeded by repasts that still left those accustomed to meager provisions in Germany utterly amazed. Daily routines occupied much of the time for numerous prisoners, who lent a hand on adjacent farmlands or contributed to the upkeep of the facility. For troops accustomed to enduring long stretches in filthy ditches, the task of carrying hay bundles or mending barriers beneath the U.S. sunlight seemed nearly like an odd vacation. Although under watch, the labor remained fair, the compensation modest but real, and in exchange they received handling more akin to that of workers than of defeated foes. A handful even murmured jests to one another in hushed tones. If this counts as captivity, then what form does liberty take? Moments of downtime brought an even greater sense of bewilderment. Rather than constant disciplinary exercises or enforced quiet, areas dedicated to amusement emerged. Within the enclosed areas, pitches for soccer and courts for volleyball took shape. As captives assembled squads and held competitions, U.S. sentries would observe at times, offer encouragement, and now and then participate themselves. Inside the sleeping quarters, sets for chess and decks for cards became common, while individuals skilled in sketching or sculpting gained permission to continue their arts. Certain facilities arranged modest ensembles equipped with tools supplied by the Red Cross, their melodies floating beyond the barriers as night fell. The setting felt otherworldly. Fighters who had clashed fiercely across North Africa and Europe now passed their nights performing Mozart, or chuckling during card sessions, as though the conflict belonged to a distant realm. Attire, as well, challenged assumptions. The standard outfits distributed were basic yet spotless, complete with durable footwear and outerwear for chillier seasons. Relative to the tattered, vermin-ridden outfits many had endured in combat, it represented a relief. Arrangements for cleanliness provided cleansing agents, bathing areas, and even haircutting options. Captives from Germany, having advanced through hamlets left in ruins, found themselves amazed by the fundamental respect granted to them in this place. A few uttered anxious questions in low voices. Why do they extend such kindness to us? What is their true aim? Doubts persisted among them, yet the truth was impossible to ignore. The U.S. Guards appeared far more focused on preserving their well-being than on crushing their spirits. Discussions around food never seemed to end. The presence of genuine white bread, actual butter, substantial portions of meat, and fresh milk left these men in awe, especially since they were well aware that their loved ones in Germany could barely secure potatoes or even horse meat. Whispers spread that the captives received provisions almost identical to those given to the American troops. A few prisoners even experienced pangs of remorse when describing their daily eats in letters home, fully conscious that their mothers, spouses, and offspring endured strict allotments and constant air raids. Still, this plentiful supply sowed seeds of fresh uncertainty. What chance did Germany truly have against a country that nourished its foes so generously? Leisure activities began modestly in the beginning. Even with heavy censorship, the newspapers permitted inside the camp offered glimpses into the broader world beyond its walls. Numerous inmates found themselves taken aback by the candid manner in which U.S. publications assailed their nation's leaders and armed forces. Such unbridled liberty in voicing opinions stood in stark opposition to the unyielding apparatus of indoctrination that defined the Third Reich. The collections in the camp's reading rooms spanned venerable works of German authorship, all the way to English-language stories from America rendered in German. Perusing tales by Mark Twain or Jack London under the dim glow of a lantern within the confines of a sleeping quarters felt strangely dreamlike. Gradually, a surprising image of the United States took shape in their minds, a land full of inconsistencies, yet far removed from the savage wilderness they had been conditioned to despise. Still, the most profound jolt lay ahead, waiting to unfold. As twilight descended and the daily regimen eased, with the detainees assembling amid a buzz of pent-up vigor, the U.S. authorities started introducing elements that went further than mere playing fields or printed pages. Inmates were called to assemble in spacious auditoriums or expansive outdoor spaces. A makeshift screen of white fabric draped one wall, while a projector hummed to life, casting bright rays into the shadowed enclosure. The German captives stared in stunned incredulity at the unfolding spectacle. Vivid, oversized projections danced before their eyes. In a gesture of unexpected generosity, the American captors were screening genuine Hollywood productions for their foes, nothing scripted as indoctrination or moralizing talks, but pure entertainment from the silver screen. For those confined within the fenced perimeters, it felt like a gateway to a distant realm had abruptly materialized. The skepticism that had first arisen from provisions and basic amenities now surged to unprecedented levels. Was this genuine, or some elaborate ruse? As the initial film spools whirred into motion within the enclosures, a profound hush descended upon the assembled detainees. They had braced for harangues, didactic sessions, or maybe crude indoctrination aimed at their degradation. But the glowing projections unveiled instead rugged horsemen charging over arid landscapes, bumbling performers tumbling into ridiculous escapades, and radiant performers swirling in song and dance, unlike anything these troops had encountered. The astonishment hit like a thunderclap. To countless among them, this marked their initial brush with U.S. filmmaking, and the divergence from the dour instructional films of the fatherland proved utterly disorienting. Rather than regimented marches and ranting orations, here unfolded chuckles, melodies, and escapism. It resembled a fragment of an alien cosmos, smuggled past the tangled barriers. At the periphery of these improvised venues, the sentries observed the scene with a blend of entertainment and intrigue. They witnessed the battle-weary expressions of the captured foes easing into grins, light-hearted snickers, and occasional bursts of genuine mirth. Certain inmates burst into applause amid the comedic antics, whereas others remained transfixed, marveling at the grand scope of the performances. To these German individuals, shaped by rigid upbringing and prolonged conflict, the abrupt plunge into tales of escapade and affection proved utterly captivating. The magic of Hollywood had slipped past the barriers, touching them in ways no armaments ever could. Reactions weren't uniformly light-hearted, however. A few of the men felt discomfort at the effortless liberty depicted in the films. They observed couples engaging in bold courtship, laborers challenging their superiors, and downtrodden figures overcoming hardship via cleverness and allure. These depictions clashed sharply with the narratives they'd absorbed about the United States, a realm supposedly rife with vice, disorder, and moral rot. In their place, the viewers caught a vision of a culture in which everyday folks appeared to possess aspirations and self-respect. In the shadows, This inconsistency tormented the captives as the projector's rhythmic clatter filled the room. Had their commanders deceived them from the start regarding the foe? The news footage brought yet another jolt of astonishment. Though selectively curated, it frequently depicted the vigorous U.S. military campaign, with humming production plants, vast armadas of vessels, or troops advancing with assured strides. To those inmates who had witnessed the dire scarcity of resources back in Germany up close, such visuals proved nearly intolerable. The overwhelming profusion of equipment, the endless streams of armored vehicles emerging from production belts, the throngs of nourished laborers, all underscored the inescapable truth that the Reich stood no chance of surpassing its adversary in output. Still, these eye-opening glimpses arrived without malice, slipping in almost offhandedly amid clips from light-hearted films and song-filled spectacles. It appeared the Americans grasped that film's true influence resided not in didactic talks, but in the gradual seepage of visuals that eroded long-held convictions. The element that most stunned the detainees was the optional nature of participation. Guards did not compel them to take seats in front of the display. They had the freedom to stay put in their quarters, engage in card games, or pen correspondence as alternatives. Nevertheless, the venues overflowed promptly each time the equipment was prepared. Card games proliferated swiftly following every showing. On any given evening, a classic Western might play, or perhaps a light-hearted comedy the following night. Veterans who had once paraded beneath the banners of the swastika discovered a newfound eagerness for these slices of American leisure. A few started compiling silent inventories of preferred performers or film categories, exchanging thoughts with their fellow detainees. Some confessed, blending embarrassment with awe, that during those brief interludes they entirely lost sight of their imprisonment. Bathed in the projector's warm radiance, a quiet transformation occurred. The enclosing razor wire receded from view, and the conflict seemed far removed. These individuals transcended their status as mere detainees in a struggle. They emerged as audience members immersed in tales that dwarfed their own existence. Whether by design or accident, the captors had bestowed upon them an invaluable boon, a portal into realms of creativity and human connection that no barrier of confinement could wholly suppress. Even as the end titles scrolled and illumination returned, a sense of incredulity persisted. They struggled to comprehend why their adversaries permitted such liberality. Still, at their core, they recognized that the memory of those cinematic evenings in the enclosures would endure forever. These projection sessions evolved into a cherished routine that the inmates awaited with subdued excitement. News of an upcoming viewing would spread swiftly across the sleeping quarters once the sentries made the declaration, prompting workers who had toiled through the daylight hours moving timber, mending barriers, or tending crops to rush their meals in hopes of claiming prime spots near the apparatus. For souls ensnared within the thorny perimeter, such nights delivered a respite, surpassing any subterranean passage. The dancing beam from the device momentarily erased the enclosures, at least across those 120 minutes. The group would huddle intently on wooden seats or settle onto the ground with legs folded, gazing intently at a realm that appeared more vibrant, unbound, and pulsating with life than the homeland they had abandoned in Germany. The selection of movies left them in stunned admiration. Humorous reels starring Charlie Chaplin or the Marx Brothers, sparked waves of genuine chuckles among assemblies of individuals who had been denied such unbridled mirth for what seemed an eternity. Films of the Western genre, featuring vast open expanses and straightforward confrontations between righteousness and wrongdoing, came across as epic fables illustrated on a canvas of outsized drama. In contrast, musicals delivered their own form of astonishment through elaborate dance sequences and sparkling attire. It was the bold opulence of a nation capable of transforming everyday existence into harmonious spectacle, even amid a worldwide conflict. Romances offered yet another layer, showcasing women whose radiant grins delivered dialogue brimming with cleverness and self-assurance. The German troops, shaped by strict societal expectations around gender, watched these depictions of bold females in quiet awe, a stark departure from the rigidly curated depictions found in propaganda from the Nazi regime. For certain individuals, this exposure edged into a risky allure. During labor assignments, they caught themselves chatting about preferred performers, mimicking humorous dialogue, or softly singing tunes well beyond the end of the showing. Indulging in the adversary's artistic output with such candor seemed nearly treasonous, but the innate allure of diversion proved overwhelmingly compelling. Not even the superiors who sought to temper excessive zeal could ignore the captivating draw of the cinema. As the theater darkened, social hierarchies dissolved entirely. Seasoned soldiers shared seats with young enlistees, each captivated by the scenes playing out on the screen. The difference from the Reich's motion pictures could not have been more pronounced. Back in Germany, movies served as instruments of propaganda, designed to exalt Hitler, the Nazi regime, and the unending battle against adversaries. Narratives there felt stiff, foreseeable, and laden with doctrine. In contrast, the U.S. productions appeared almost recklessly liberated. They had the liberty to ridicule power structures, lampoon the elite, or hail the victories of everyday folks. Among themselves, the captives murmured in astonishment, "How might this apparent disorder forge a country capable of waging war on multiple fronts around the globe?" But as they viewed more of these pictures, it dawned on them that the disorder wasn't a flaw. Rather, it represented a dynamic energy unlike anything they had experienced. A few of the captives started sending letters back to their loved ones describing the film showings, even if strict censorship blocked any detailed accounts. In one such note, a soldier vaguely alluded to peculiar diversions being presented to them, ones that temporarily erased their sense of surroundings. Those relatives in Germany, scraping by with food coupons and filtered government broadcasts, struggled to even conceive of anything like it. The notion that enemy troops in custody could enjoy Hollywood films seemed utterly preposterous. Nevertheless, inside the enclosures, these movie sessions turned into the hottest topic among the inmates, functioning much like a vital boost to their spirits. Consequently, the skepticism only grew stronger. Having been conditioned to anticipate harsh treatment, the German detainees discovered they were surrounded by humor, tunes, and tales instead. This wasn't liberty by any means, yet it offered a tantalizing glimpse of something perilously akin to it. Every evening's film viewing filled the captives with a mix of appreciation and disquiet, prompting questions about why their adversaries permitted this lavish diversion, and how it could be influencing their allegiances and sense of self. What once served merely as diversion on the screen had evolved into a quiet mentor, altering their perspectives on the broader reality and their own places within the fenced confines. With the passage of time from weeks to months, these regular evening projections fostered developments much deeper than simple recreation. The inmates engaged in prolonged discussions over the content they had viewed, scrutinizing not only the storylines, but also the principles they embodied. A humorous film could provoke arguments over the essence of U.S. wit, which appeared grounded in ridiculing arrogant power structures while championing the overlooked. A cowboy tale might trigger exchanges on liberty, fairness, and the expansive, unbound terrains that evoked horizons stretching well past the realm of conflict. Romances, initially brushed off as superficial, ultimately exposed discomforting truths. The forthright expressions of tenderness, the self-reliance of female characters, and the easygoing exchanges among people pointed to a culture considerably more flexible than the structured world they had departed. Gradually and subtly, these movies began to erode the rigid convictions that decades of Nazi propaganda had deeply embedded in their minds. Wardens observed the subtle shift, as the initial fierce resentment from incoming detainees, once intense and barely contained, gradually faded with the passage of days. Detainees who had once loudly proclaimed the inevitable triumph of Germany fell into a hushed silence, their once unshakable confidence now profoundly undermined. No longer did they harbor visions of rejoining a victorious empire. Instead, a growing number murmured questions about the reality of such a world filled with plenty and liberty waiting just outside the barriers. Through these screenings, vivid scenes took root. Markets teeming with an abundance of items, everyday citizens of the United States chuckling together in cinema halls, and lively melodies filling the air of bustling dance venues. The stark visuals on screen clashed sharply with the grim realities of food queues and ruined urban landscapes that the captives anticipated upon their return to Germany. Not even the steadiest of them could entirely hold back. When officers attempted to dismiss the movies as nothing more than propaganda, they faced pushback from their troops, who highlighted the vast gap between these lively depictions and the rigid outputs from Goebbels' propaganda office. "If this is propaganda," one trooper whispered following a musical number, "then it's the loveliest form of it I've ever encountered." A comrade replied, "Maybe it's no propaganda whatsoever, just a glimpse of their everyday existence." Such exchanges exposed the subtle peril lurking in leisure activities. They sidestepped political doctrines and struck at the heart of basic human desires. Though the U.S. forces likely never meant for it to serve as mental combat, the impact proved impossible to overlook. As the detainees chuckled through Hollywood farces, it grew tougher to view America as an impersonal foe. The more they respected the tenacity of protagonists surmounting adversity, the more they doubted the Nazi assertion that true power stemmed solely from regimentation and submission. Stories of neighborhoods banding together, rebels standing against dishonest rulers, or everyday folks rising to prominence all undermined the rigid, top-down perspective these men had brought with them into imprisonment. To the less experienced troops, these pictures held an almost addictive allure. Adolescents steeped in the fervor of Hitler Youth gatherings discovered in these films an alternative vision of bravery, one tied not to military garb and national symbols, but to personal freedom and boldness. They jotted down performers' names in their journals, picked up bits of English from multiple viewings, and attempted to mimic the bold gait of U.S. ranch hands. What started as simple diversion evolved into a profound cultural captivation. Even censored correspondence sent back home offered subtle clues to these evolving circumstances. Relatives, attuned to unspoken implications, realized that imprisonment across the Atlantic was far from the harsh nightmare they had anticipated. Certain captives shared with fellow inmates how the screenings evoked memories of calmer eras, evoking carefree days from their early years prior to the all-consuming conflict. In private admissions to trusted peers, some revealed a reluctance to depart the enclosure, anxious that they might never encounter such plenty, liberty, or carefree spirit again. Initial skepticism during those early viewings gradually yielded to a deeper, enduring shift in their outlook on life. Though the fences of razor-sharp wire still hemmed them in, their inner landscapes were broadening. The allure of Tinseltown had infiltrated their consciousness, eroding long-held convictions. They had arrived at the facilities as devoted fighters for the fatherland. Gradually, they emerged as individuals whose vision of the world had irrevocably altered. The U.S. forces had uncovered cinema's power to temper the most resolute adversaries, not through coercion, but through compelling tales. With the conflict dragging inexorably to its close, the detainees started envisioning existence beyond the barriers. Once the entrances swung wide, and transport took them eastward to their homeland. For numerous individuals, the prospect of rejoining their loved ones stirred a blend of apprehension and anticipation. Reports from kin and humanitarian dispatches painted a stark picture of aerial assaults, scarcities, and widespread ruin afflicting their households. Urban centers of their upbringing lay in ruins, while the once mighty empire contracted relentlessly. The stark disparity between the grim truths awaiting them abroad and the unexpected amenities of detention in the United States pressed profoundly upon their psyches. Among the experiences they would bear with them, perhaps the most implausible were the evenings immersed in U.S. films. Once hostilities ceased on the continent, and the process of sending captives home commenced, clusters of soldiers once again set sail, now traversing the sea westward. They gathered on the upper levels, gazing out over the endless waters, aware they were abandoning not merely the new world, but the unusual existence forged within its guarded perimeters. In subdued conversations, tinged with a touch of sheepishness, they spoke of the elements they would long for: the meals, the games of football, the tobacco, and especially the radiant beam from the film apparatus. "No soul in our country will credit this," remarked one of them. "People would surely believe we'd lost our minds." One replied, "How could we possibly explain that we chuckled at Hollywood comedies even as our towns lay in ruins?" The challenge they faced was genuine. Sharing candid details of life in the camps could invite skepticism or outright charges of treason. Nevertheless, the tales circulated regardless. Throughout rural communities in Germany, ex-captives murmured about their bizarre imprisonment. They recounted evenings where vast groups of soldiers gathered quietly, mesmerized as Clark Gable or Ginger Rogers flickered to life on the projector. They spoke of vibrant musicals bursting with vitality, of Western heroes charging across vast plains, of love stories that captured an unfamiliar sense of liberty. Relatives heard these narratives with wide-eyed wonder, finding it hard to picture their boys and spouses finding humor in movies amid the crumbling Third Reich. To numerous ordinary folk, such reports felt like pure invention, or something more sinister, fabricated tales designed to downplay the hardships borne on the home front. Even so, those recollections stuck firmly with the survivors. Certain ex-detainees confessed that the movie showings had reshaped their perspective on existence itself. No longer could they cling to the straightforward divide between a virtuous Reich and malevolent foes. They had glimpsed a different facet of the United States, beyond its sheer firepower, encompassing its customs, its wit, and its talent for transforming everyday existence into something artistic. As they navigated the devastated avenues of Germany, while striving to piece together their shattered existences, the light from those movie screens lingered in their memories. It served as a subtle signpost of the profound transformation in their outlook on the world. What stood out most in their accounts was the everyday normalcy that the film showings held for the Americans involved. The sentries would position the equipment with effortless routine, as if permitting captives to enjoy Hollywood productions was utterly unexceptional. For the Germans, though, it felt profoundly unusual, a bizarre reversal of all their preconceptions about what imprisonment entailed. Certain individuals recalled it as the pivotal instant when they understood that the U.S. wasn't merely a dominant force in technology and armaments, but equally a giant in creativity. In later years, when veterans reflected on their stint in U.S. detention facilities, numerous ones glossed past the aspects of work or strict oversight. Rather than dwelling on hardships, these men would speak in gentler tones about the evenings dedicated to films. To them, such times offered far more than mere amusement. They served as a temporary escape from the burdens of conflict, a brief vision of an alternative tomorrow, and an enduring recollection that outlasted the era of fences and restrictions. Over the subsequent decades, the recollection of those film screenings within U.S. detention facilities emerged as one of the war's most peculiar enduring marks for the survivors. Among numerous ex-captives, the scene of huddling closely with fellow soldiers to view U.S. movies, all while under the vigilant gaze of sentries, imprinted itself as profoundly as the combats they had endured. This contradiction stayed with them throughout their days. Although they had once opposed the United States as adversaries, it was the United States that had granted them instances of delight and shared human warmth amid the most shadowy phase of their existence. In subsequent discussions with scholars, the topic of cinema surfaced repeatedly. Certain individuals chuckled over committing dialogue from humorous pictures to memory or developing affections for Tinseltown stars they hadn't anticipated encountering in projections. More reflective voices described the pictures as their initial exposure to an alternate reality, a perspective that challenged the grim portrayal disseminated by fascist misinformation. They recalled the way those projected sequences unveiled a culture that cherished humor, innovation, and personal expression, attributes that the authoritarian regime had all but extinguished through its unyielding structure. The effects extended further than personal reminiscences. During the era of rebuilding in Germany after the war, particularly in the Reconstruction period, elements of American culture started to permeate the nation more freely. Ex-prisoners of war frequently served as unwitting cultural messengers, sharing with relatives and acquaintances the movies they had encountered during their imprisonment. They spoke of the wit, the tunes, the epic tales, and the boundless energy emanating from Hollywood productions. For the younger generation of Germans who yearned for alternatives to the rubble left by surrender, such narratives ignited a fascination with life across the Atlantic. While the Marshall Plan restored roads and buildings, it was these personal anecdotes, tales of amusement echoing through guarded enclosures, that revived creative spirits. Certain ex-soldiers later acknowledged that their eventual embrace of democratic principles and Western values originated from those evenings spent in detention. Although no one movie alone transformed perspectives, the consistent immersion in U.S. films gradually tempered the resolve of battle-weary troops in ways that combat could never achieve. The ideas sown in those improvised screening venues eventually bore fruit long afterward, as once adversarial individuals integrated into a revitalized West Germany, now partnered with the country they had previously opposed. In this light, the beam from the cinema apparatus emerged as a subtle, unforeseen tool for fostering peace. Still, astonishment lingered on. Even many years afterward, ex-captives would laugh softly and shrug in reflection, remarking, "We were the foes, yet they allowed us to view films." For those prisoners, the experience endured as an emblem of the United States' immense self-assurance and prosperity, a nation of such might that it could extend amusement even to those it held. Beyond that, it might have mirrored a more profound truth, the notion that artistic expression and creativity held power equal to that of artillery and armored vehicles. The enduring impact of those film showings persisted beyond mere recollection, fostering a connection across cultures that they actively nurtured. Soldiers who had previously advanced under Hitler's banner brought back with them a hidden tale of evenings where joy and melodies echoed through the confines of detention centers. They shared with their offspring and descendants the way they had encountered the essence of America, not via the barrel of a weapon, but amid the radiance emanating from a cinema projection. Within that odd, shimmering illumination, they came to realize that amid confinement, the human spirit endured, and amid conflict, the foundations of reconciliation could take root.